Long before air fryers, Pinterest boards, or recipe blogs, hillbilly families figured out how to stretch food, fix mistakes, and keep meals on the table with whatever they had. These were not shortcuts or trends. They were survival skills learned in isolated hollers, coal camps, and mountain farms where stores were far away and money was scarce. In this video, we'll explore 25 country kitchen tricks only hillbilly families knew and why they worked. 1. Cooking beans with ashes nearby. In many country kitchens, dried beans cooked for hours on wood or coal stoves that never held steady heat. The problem was not the beans, it was the fire. When a stove burned too hot, beans scorched on the bottom long before they softened. When it burned too cool, they stalled and stayed tough, pushing supper later and later. Families learned quickly that stirring could not fix bad heat. Fire control mattered more than movement. A small container of clean wood ashes was often kept nearby, not to season food, but to manage the burn. When the draft pulled too hard and the fire flared, ashes could be added to the firebox to settle the coals and slow how fast oxygen fed the flames. This dulled the heat without killing it. Beans were kept on a cooler part of the stove and left mostly undisturbed, so starch did not thicken and stick. They were usually started early in the day, allowing time to make small adjustments as the fire changed with added fuel or shifting air. People learned this method because a ruined pot meant wasted fuel, wasted time, and no supper, and starting over was rarely an option. 2. Saving grease in a coffee can. In country kitchens, bacon grease was treated as a resource, not a leftover. After breakfast, hot grease was poured carefully through a cloth or flour sack to strain out crumbs, then saved in whatever metal container was available, most often an old coffee can kept close to the stove. This mattered because fat carried calories, flavor, and cooking power at a time when butter was expensive, and store-bought shortening was not always on hand. Grease slicked cornbread pans, browned potatoes, and flavored beans without needing extra meat. The can stayed nearby because it was used constantly, sometimes several times in one meal. Moisture was the main enemy. If water got into the grease, it spoiled quickly, so cooks learned to keep the container warm enough to stay dry and never sealed tight. If the grease smelled wrong, it was discarded without debate. People learned how long it kept by experience, not labels. Saving grease stretched meals, reduced waste, and made plain food satisfying. Throwing it away meant wasting fuel, effort, and flavor all at once. 3. Baking bread while supper cooked. In country kitchens, bread baking was timed around the fire, not convenience. When the stove was already hot enough to cook supper, that heat was used for bread at the same time. Biscuits, pone bread, or loaves were mixed earlier and held until the oven reached the right strength, then slid in while beans or stew simmered below. This mattered because fuel was work. Firewood had to be cut, hauled, and split, and coal cost money. Letting a hot stove cool only to fire it back up later wasted both. Cooks learned the narrow window when the oven was steady enough to bake without burning. Too early and the bread stayed pale and heavy. Too late and it scorched before it set. The timing came from watching how the stove behaved through the day as fuel was added and drafts shifted. Bread baking fit into the rhythm of the meal, not the other way around. This habit allowed one fire to do multiple jobs and kept the kitchen running efficiently without extra effort. 4. Using cast iron as a heat regulator. In country kitchens, cast iron mattered because fires were unreliable. Wood and coal stoves surged and dipped depending on fuel size, draft, and weather. Thin pans reacted too fast and burned food before it had a chance to cook through. Cast iron absorbed heat slowly and released it evenly, acting as a buffer between the fire and the food. This was especially important for cornmeal dishes, gravies, and anything cooked low and steady. A heavy skillet could be shifted to a cooler spot on the stove without shocking the food. People learned quickly which pans behaved best and kept those in daily rotation. Seasoning built up through repeated use, improving performance and reducing sticking. A pan that worked was protected and passed along because replacing it was not easy. Cast iron stayed because it forgave uneven heat and reduced mistakes in kitchens where precision tools did not exist. 5. Cooling hot milk with shallow pans. Fresh milk spoiled fast in warm houses, especially in summer. The solution was spreading it thin so heat could escape quickly. Milk was poured into wide, shallow pans and set in the coolest part of the house, often near a window or on a table where air moved freely. Surface area mattered more than container size. Cooling milk, too, slowly meant sour milk by morning. Cooling it quickly meant cream rising cleanly overnight. People learned which rooms stayed coolest and which times of day worked best. Milk was watched closely, not assumed safe. Cream was skimmed and used for cooking or coffee, while the rest was kept for drinking. This practice came from experience with temperature and timing, not written instruction. Milk stayed usable because people understood how heat behaved inside their own houses. 6. Hanging food in cloth sacks. Storage in country homes depended on air, not containers. Cupboards stayed warm from the stove, and shelves invited insects and mice. To solve this, foods like onions, apples, and cured meat were hung in cloth sacks from hooks or pegs. Flour sacks, feed sacks, and old pillowcases were commonly used. The cloth allowed air to circulate while keeping pests out. Placement mattered. Hung too close to the stove, food spoiled. Hung near a draft, it kept longer. High ceilings and cooler corners made this method work well. This habit came from farm storage practices where airflow prevented rot better than sealed spaces. People learned quickly where food lasted longest and adjusted accordingly. Hanging food kept it dry, visible, and out of reach, turning the house itself into part of the storage system. 7. Reviving stale bread over steam. In country kitchens, bread was rarely thrown out just because it went hard. Baking happened once or twice a week, and store bread was not always close by. When loaves stiffened, slices were held over a kettle or pot of boiling water so steam could soften them again. The steam rehydrated the bread without soaking it, making it usable for supper or breakfast. Some cooks wrapped the loaf in a damp cloth and set it near the stove, watching closely so it did not scorch. This method showed up in rural household advice as far back as the late 1800s. It worked because it restored moisture without changing flavor. Bread lasted longer because people knew how to bring it back, not because it stayed perfect. 8. Keeping a pot always going. In many country homes, especially during colder months, one pot stayed in regular use. Beans, greens, or soup simmered gently, with fresh ingredients added as they became available. This practice saved fuel and reduced waste. Starting from scratch every night required more heat and more time. Instead, the pot was brought to a boil each day for safety, then set back to a low eye to continue cooking. This habit fit households where schedules were unpredictable and people came and went throughout the day. Someone could eat whenever they got in. The pot stayed ready because it was easier to keep it going than to rebuild it over and over again. 9. Using salt to control moisture. Salt served more purposes than seasoning. In country kitchens, it helped control moisture. Small dishes of salt were placed in cupboards to absorb dampness that caused mold. Salt was rubbed onto wooden cutting boards to dry them and prevent odors from settling in. Meat meant for short keeping was lightly salted and stored in the coolest part of the house. These practices mattered in homes without ice boxes or electricity. Salt was dependable, inexpensive, and well understood. People knew how much to use by feel. Too much ruined food. Too little invited spoilage. Managing moisture meant food lasted longer without added effort. 10. Letting dough rest longer than recipes said. In country kitchens, dough did not rise according to instructions. It rose according to the house. Many homes stayed cool even with a stove burning, especially in winter or in houses with thin walls and drafty floors. Yeast worked slower in those conditions, and cooks learned quickly that forcing dough to rise too fast ruined texture. Bread dough was mixed early, often before the day's work began, then left to rise while chores were done. Cooks checked it by touch, pressing a finger lightly into the surface and watching how it responded. If it sprang back immediately, it needed more time. If it stayed sunken, it had gone too far. This judgment came from repetition, not teaching. Dough waited when it had to, because animals still needed feeding and wood still needed hauling. Slow rises were normal, not mistakes. Letting dough take its time produced loaves that held together better and baked more evenly in unreliable ovens. The trick worked because people adjusted their expectations to the conditions, instead of trying to force the conditions to match a recipe. 11. Warming plates to stretch hot food. Meals in country households were rarely eaten all at once. People came in from fields, barns, or work shifts at different times, and reheating food meant using more fuel. To keep supper usable, plates were warmed on the back of the stove or stacked near the oven before serving. Warm plates slowed heat loss and kept gravies from tightening too fast. Fried food stayed crisp longer instead of turning limp on cold dishes. This mattered in kitchens where food cooled quickly once it left the stove. The practice showed up in farmhouses, boarding houses, and work camps alike. Plates were rotated carefully so they warmed without cracking. Nothing about it was decorative. It was a way to protect the effort already spent cooking the meal. Warming plates bought time for late arrivals and reduced waste. The food held its quality longer because the surface it rested on was already warm. 12. Using vinegar to fix oversalted food. Seasoning by eye sometimes went wrong, especially when cooking large pots over long hours. When food turned too salty, country cooks reached for vinegar to correct it. A small amount added to beans, greens, or soup softened the sharp edge without making the dish sour. This wasn't guesswork. Vinegar was already used for pickling, preserving, and everyday cooking, so its effect was well understood. Apple vinegar was common because orchards were nearby, and bottles kept well. The goal was balance, not disguise. Too much vinegar ruined food just as surely as too much salt. Learning how little was needed took experience. Fixing a pot mattered when ingredients were hard-earned, and throwing food away was not an option. This trick allowed cooks to rescue meals that otherwise would have been wasted and taught restraint through repetition. 13. Keeping flour in cloth instead of tins. Flour storage mattered in damp houses where sealed containers trapped moisture. Metal tins often caused flour to sweat, clump, or spoil, especially in warm weather. Many country cooks stored flour in cloth sacks instead, allowing it to breathe. The fabric discouraged insects while preventing condensation from building up. Flour was checked often, sifted not only for texture, but to inspect its condition. Smell and feel told whether it was still usable. This practice came from mill storage methods where airflow mattered more than tight seals. A cook learned what good flour felt like and noticed changes quickly. Since biscuits and bread were everyday food, flour reliability mattered. Storage was not passive. Flour was watched, handled, and protected because everything else in the kitchen depended on it behaving as expected. 14. Cooking by sound instead of sight. Country kitchens were not always well lit, and lids stayed on pots to hold heat and keep soot out. Sound became a guide. A steady simmer meant things were on track. A sudden quiet meant trouble. Frying had its own signals, and bubbling changed pitch as moisture cooked off. Cooks listened closely and adjusted heat by ear as much as by sight. Wood and coal fires shifted constantly, so sound provided feedback when the flame could not be trusted. This skill developed slowly through daily cooking. Children learned it standing nearby, not through explanation. Cooking was not silent work. Pots, pans, and fires all made noise, and experienced hands learned to respond to those sounds before food burned or boiled dry. 15. Using the coolest room in the house as storage. Before electric refrigeration was common, country families paid close attention to which room stayed coolest year-round. Often, it was a back bedroom, a north-facing room, or a space over a stone foundation. Milk, leftovers, pies, and cooked meats were set there overnight to slow spoilage. Some houses even had a specific corner known for staying cool, especially where air moved through cracks or floorboards. This practice came from necessity. Ice was expensive or unavailable, and springs were not always close. People learned their houses the way they learned their land. They knew where heat settled and where it did not. Food safety depended on this awareness. Nothing was left randomly. Placement mattered, and experience taught which foods could handle the cool air and which could not. 16. Reusing hot water instead of dumping it. Water had weight, and hauling it took time. In homes without running water, hot water from cooking was rarely dumped right away. Water used to boil vegetables or pasta was saved for dishwashing, cleaning counters, or even soaking stubborn pots. This habit reduced trips to the well or pump and made full use of the fuel already spent heating the water. The idea was simple. Once water was hot, you used it until it cooled. This practice shows up in rural housekeeping guides from the early 1900s and was common in farm kitchens where efficiency mattered. Nothing about it was fancy. It was practical thinking applied day after day, especially during winter when heating water took longer and hauling it was harder. 17. Letting meat rest longer because fires were uneven. Country cooks understood that meat continued to cook after leaving the heat, especially when cooked in heavy pans or Dutch ovens. Uneven fires made precise timing difficult, so meat was often pulled early and allowed to rest longer before cutting. This helped juices redistribute and prevented dryness, even if nobody used those terms. The habit developed because wood and coal fires did not behave like steady burners. Heat surged, dropped, and shifted. Resting meat acted as a buffer against those swings. A roast set aside near the stove finished gently without burning. Cutting too soon meant losing moisture, something people noticed quickly when meat was scarce. The trick came from observation, not instruction. You learned by ruining a piece once and not doing it again. 18. Using cornmeal to control sticking and moisture. Cornmeal served more purposes than bread. It was sprinkled in pans to prevent sticking, used under dough to absorb excess moisture, and scattered lightly on boards where food needed to dry. This was especially common in corn-growing regions where meal was plentiful and cheap. Cornmeal absorbed dampness better than flour and added texture without gumming up surfaces. It was also used under fish or sliced vegetables before frying to keep surfaces dry. This habit reflects a broader country kitchen approach. Use what you already have in multiple ways. Cornmeal earned its place because it solved problems quietly and predictably. 19. Planning meals around fuel, not recipes. One of the biggest differences in country kitchens was that meals were planned around the fire, not the recipe. If the stove was already hot, baking happened. If fuel was low, simmering dishes took priority. Foods that required steady heat were timed for days when wood was plentiful or the stove stayed lit. This thinking shaped what got cooked and when. Long cooking foods waited for cold days when the fire burned all day. Quick foods were saved for times when fuel was scarce. This approach came from living where fuel had to be gathered, split, and hauled. Cooking was organized around heat availability, not preference. The trick was knowing how to adapt meals to the conditions instead of forcing the conditions to fit the meal. 20. Using cloth instead of lids to control steam. In country kitchens, not every pot had a proper lid that fit well. A common workaround was laying a folded cloth or flour sack over the top of a pot to control steam. The cloth absorbed excess moisture while still letting heat escape slowly. This helped prevent boilovers and kept foods like beans or greens from becoming watery. The cloth was never allowed to touch the flame and was watched carefully. This practice shows up in older household advice columns and was common in homes where cookware was mismatched or worn. The trick required attention. Too much steam escaped and food dried out. Too little and liquid built up. It was another example of using simple materials to fine-tune cooking when equipment was limited. 21. Keeping a small pan just for gravy. Many country kitchens kept one small pan reserved almost entirely for gravy. This pan was seasoned, familiar, and trusted. Its size made it easier to control heat and prevent scorching, especially on uneven fires. Gravy was made often and mistakes were noticeable. A pan that held heat evenly and did not stick mattered. Using the same pan repeatedly improved results because the surface behaved predictably. This habit was not sentimental. It was practical. When a pan worked, you stuck with it. Gravy success depended less on ingredients and more on knowing exactly how your pan behaved on your stove. 22. Letting fried foods drain on paper or cloth. Before racks and absorbent towels were common, fried foods were set on brown paper, feed sackcloth, or even clean newspaper to drain. This allowed grease to wick away without steaming the food. Plates trapped moisture underneath, making crusts soggy. Paper and cloth solved that problem. This practice was widespread in rural kitchens where fried foods were everyday fare. The choice of surface mattered. It had to absorb grease without sticking or tearing. People learned what worked by trial. The goal was simple: keep the food from getting heavy or limp before it reached the table. 23. Using the same order. Every time at the stove. In kitchens with limited space and uneven heat, the order of cooking mattered. Experienced cooks followed the same sequence every day. Something simmered while something else fried. Bread went in last or first, depending on the fire. This order reduced mistakes and saved fuel. Changing the routine invited problems. The habit developed because the stove behaved differently at different stages of the burn. Early heat was sharp, later, heat was steady. Planning meals around that pattern made cooking more predictable. The trick was not creativity. It was consistency learned over time. 24. Passing tricks by watching, not explaining. Many of these kitchen habits were never written down because they were learned by watching. Children stood close, handed tools, and listened. Instructions were short or non-existent. You learned by doing it wrong once and being corrected. This method of teaching fit busy households where work came first and time was short. Knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next without formal lessons. The kitchen was a place of repetition. That repetition built skill. These tricks lasted because they were practiced daily, not because anyone thought to name them or preserve them in print. 25. Freezing leftover coffee cubes. Freezing leftover coffee into ice cubes was a simple trick many coffee drinkers wish they'd learned sooner. Instead of dumping extra coffee down the sink, country cooks poured it into ice cube trays and set it aside to freeze. Those coffee cubes had a smart purpose. Dropped into iced coffee, they kept the drink chilled without watering it down the way plain ice does. As the cubes melted, the coffee stayed bold and full-flavored instead of turning thin and weak. That wasn't the only way they were used. Bakers found that adding a few coffee cubes to chocolate cake batter or brownie mix deepened the chocolate flavor without making the dessert taste like coffee. Smoothie makers tossed one or two into the blender for a mild pick-me-up. Some cooks even slipped coffee cubes into beef stews or gravies to add richness and depth. In a time when wasting food was not an option, this small habit turned leftover morning coffee into a useful, flexible kitchen staple. These kitchen tricks were never meant to impress anyone. They existed because people had to eat, had to stretch what they had, and had to make things work in houses where conditions were rarely ideal. Nothing here came from trends or instructions printed on a box. It came from repetition, observation, and necessity. These habits survived because they solved real problems in real kitchens day after day. Some of them faded when convenience took over. Others are still hiding in plain sight, passed along quietly without names or credit. They remind us that cooking was once less about choice and more about understanding your space, your tools, and your limits. And that kind of knowledge does not disappear easily. It just waits for someone to notice it again.